All right, let's talk about our last plant hormone, ethylene, which is a gas. Ethylene is one of those scientific discoveries that happened accidentally because gas street lights were causing trees to lose their leaves early. So ethylene is associated with responses to stress in the plant. It's associated with end of season things like fruit ripening and leaf dropping. One of the things that ethylene does is cause this so-called triple response to mechanical stress. And the kind of mechanical stress this is an adaptation for is a seedling that's trying to emerge from the soil, but it hits an obstacle. So that little growing tip of the seedling pushing up against something, that is what triggers the production of ethylene and triggers this triple response. So the three things that happen in the triple response is the stem is shorter, so stem elongation is slowed, the stem gets thicker, and it starts to grow horizontally. And this would be, if a seed is starting to grow and there's actually a rock on top of it, it will allow it to go around the obstacle. So this is an adaptation for emergence from the soil. And here are seedlings that were given different doses of ethylene. So these weren't all growing right next to each other because ethylene is a gas. This is a photographic composite where they just put all these photographs together. So each of these seedlings the first one here had no ethylene, and then increasing amounts of ethylene. And you'll notice that the shoots aren't as long, the stem is thicker, and finally with the higher concentrations of ethylene, it actually starts to grow sideways. And so this is an adaptation for emerging seedlings to avoid and grow around obstacles. The dropping of leaves, again, is caused by a change in auxin. So auxin is reduced and ethylene is increased. And this will cause leaves to fall. So it's a slow process because all or many of the molecules in the leaves are actually sequestered in the stem of the woody plant for the winter. So a green leaf is not going to drop off. Instead, that's why the leaves change color, is because the chlorophyll and other molecules that are important that are in the leaf get stored in the stem for the winter, and then the leaf drops off. But it actually weakens. You can see a little split here that's stimulated by the production of ethylene. Fruit ripening can be controlled in many cases by controlling the ethylene. And you might have heard that if you put bananas in a paper bag, or if you put apples in a paper bag that are unripe, that they will ripen. Well, the reason is because it increases the concentration of ethylene. So ripening bananas and ripening apples produce ethylene. So if you put them inside of a paper bag, it keeps the ethylene in there because ethylene is a gas, it's volatile, it evaporates. So if you keep them in a paper bag, that will keep the ethylene in, and it will cause them to ripen more quickly. And this is used extensively in commercial fruit operations now. This is an example of a banana ripening operation. So the fact that we know that ethylene triggers the ripening of fruits, this allows things to be picked when they're green, and they're much less likely to bruise. So green bananas are well, actually, I don't think bananas will even ripen if they're on the tree. I think you have to remove them from the tree to get them to ripen. But they can remove them when they're very green. They can store them in warehouses, and then and they protect them from their own ethylene by flooding the room with carbon dioxide, and that pushes the ethylene out. And then when they want them to ripen, they add ethylene to the atmosphere in a closed room, and that will trigger ripening. They do the same thing with tomatoes. Tomatoes are all picked green, and they are ripened in a warehouse with added ethylene. So this allows us to have a longer time period between picking in the market. It's the way that we get out of season fruits. So you get apples in the grocery store in March, even though they were picked in September and October. That's when apples are in season in the Northern Hemisphere, is September and October. But you can still get good apples in March because they store them without ethylene until they're ready to go to the grocery store, and then they can allow the ethylene to help their last bit of ripening. Now, too much ethylene, eventually they're going to get mealy and overripe. But back in the olden days, before they understood this process, fruits like apples were very seasonal, and you could only get them. You could only get apples in the grocery store for a few months of the year, maybe up through December, and then that was it. It would be like September, October, November, December, and then there were no more apples in the grocery store until the next September. And now, because they can control fruit ripening, we have fresh fruits in the grocery store when they're not in season, because of this ability to be stored for up to a year. So if you're getting apples in the grocery store in July or August, they're from the previous growing season. We can't make apples grow at other times of the year. So the apples are all harvested in September and October, and the apples that you're getting in the grocery store in August are from the previous September, and they've been stored in one of these atmosphere-controlled warehouses since then. Plant response to light is really important, and we already talked a little bit at the beginning of this section about etiolation. Plants' response to no light is to have fast-growing stems and no chlorophyll. And then de-etiolation, when they're exposed to light, they green up and stem growth slows and goes back to normal. So any changes in the plant's shape or growth that are caused by light is called photomorphogenesis. So stems growing towards the light, leaves growth towards the light, that's photomorphogenesis. Anything that's triggered by light. So plants respond to different parts of the spectrum differently. And interestingly, blue light appears to be extremely important for plants' response to the direction of light. So here's the light spectrum, and just to refresh your memory here, so visible light is from about 700 to about 400 nanometers in wavelength. So the shorter the wavelength, so 400 nanometers is higher energy than 700 nanometers. UV or ultraviolet, we can't see ultraviolet. Some animals can see ultraviolet, like some insects like bees, and some birds can see ultraviolet. We can't see in the ultraviolet. That's even shorter wavelength and higher energy. And then at the other end of the spectrum, the low energy red light. Infrared, that's what IR stands for, and that means below red. Infra means below. So infrared is below the red, and that's heat. So plants use the blue part of the spectrum here, blue light, for detecting the direction of the sun. And interestingly, our animal brains also use blue light to detect day and night. So blue light is the most effective part of the spectrum at triggering your brain and that it's daytime. And lack of blue light is the trigger that your brain uses to produce melatonin, which tells us it's now nighttime and it's time to sleep. And we'll talk more about that in a later chapter. But it's interesting that plants use blue light as well to determine which direction the sun is. And one of the hypotheses for why both animals and plants use blue light to determine the direction of the sun is that green algae and animals first evolved in the sea. And red does not penetrate very deep. The higher energy light penetrates much more deeply into the water. So red light just wouldn't have been very available for anything under the ocean where animals evolved. And the deeper you go, the less blue light there, or the less red light there is, and the more it's totally blue light dominated. So that, I guess it's not too much of a surprise that both plants and animals use blue light for various purposes. Red light and even infrared, far red light is used by plants as well for different purposes. So here's our active, our action spectrum here for detection of the direction of light. So when we, as I just showed you, when you break out light, you have the low energy red to the highest energy, which is violet, and it's the blue light that triggers the most bending of the stems. These are supposed to be our little grass stems again that are responding to light. And blue light, if you give plants only part of the spectrum, blue light triggers the most bending. So it's blue light that plants are detecting. And if you put that information on a graph, you can see that there's some violet and all the way through the entire blue part of the spectrum can stimulate the stem bending in plants. Plants also have a circadian rhythm. So circadian rhythm is the biological clock. And we have a circadian rhythm even if we kept you in 100% light or 100% darkness for days at a time. And these experiments have been done with people. Your body clock continues to run. And there are hormones that are secreted at night. There are other things that happen during the day. As it gets close to morning, cortisol is secreted. And get you going on your day, and plants do the same thing. They have an oscillation of responses that occurs day and night, and it's reset every day with the exposure to light. And our body clock does the same thing. Our body clock tends to run a little bit longer than 24 hours, and so does plants. And it's reset every day by your exposure to blue light. So many plants change their position of their leaves during the day and at night. And like beans here, this is a little bean seedling again. And even if you keep them in 100% light or 100% darkness, the leaves will still rise during the day and drop at night. And this is one of the ways, these type of experiments are one of the ways we know that the plant's natural circadian clock runs a little bit longer than 24 hours, just like ours does, and that it gets reset every day with exposure to blue light. And if you keep them in 100% darkness or 100% light, the circadian clock still runs, but it's, they call that a free running clock, and that's how we know that it's a little longer than 24 hours. So photoperiodism, many plants use the length of day and night to determine when to bloom. Some plants bloom in the spring, some plants only bloom in the late summer or in the fall. This is important because they want to time the production of their fruits and their seeds for the best benefit and the best chance of producing offspring. There are also plants that are what are called Dayneutral, which they produce flowers and fruit in response to the plant's own internal maturity, and it has nothing to do with day length. Like tomatoes are like that. Tomatoes are day neutral, so that also means that you can grow them anywhere because they don't care how long the day or the night is. So it was noticed hundreds of years ago that there are so-called short day plants which flower as the daylight gets shorter and shorter, so towards the fall. And then there are long day plants which flower as the days get longer and longer in the spring. So these would be spring flowering plants. Short day plants would be fall or late summer. And it was discovered in the 1940s that it wasn't the day length that the plants were detecting at all. That in fact, what plants are detecting is the length of the night. They are detecting the uninterrupted darkness. And in fact, there are many flowering plants that will not flower without a certain length of uninterrupted darkness. Like African violets are a short day plant, and they will not flower if they don't have 8 hours of uninterrupted darkness. And it does not take much to interrupt their darkness and stop them from blooming. I used to have an African violet that I received looking very much like this with nice lovely flowers on it, and it quickly stopped blooming. And I had it for many years, and although it looked very healthy and had nice healthy leaves, it did not bloom. And I had no idea why. And then I went on vacation. And the plant happened to be, and this was in the winter, so very long nights, and the violet happened to be in a room that was in total darkness while I was out of town during the night. So the only light the plant was getting was the natural light from coming in from a window. And when I got back from my vacation, there were buds on the plant, and it proceeded to bloom for the first time in years. So if you have a flowering plant that is indoors and is not blooming, this could be the reason, because it requires uninterrupted darkness for longer than it's getting at your house. So those would be short day plants. They require some minimum number of hours of darkness. So generally in the wild, outside, these plants would be blooming as the days get shorter. So the longest day and the shortest night of the year are around June 21st, the summer solstice, and then the days start to get shorter, which means the nights are getting longer. So after June 21st, the nights start getting longer, and there are plants that respond to that day shortening or night lengthening by blooming, and those are the short day plants. Everything that blooms in the late summer and the fall would be a short day plant, unless it's a day neutral plant like a tomato. The long day plants, these are things that bloom in the spring. These don't need a long night in order to bloom. In fact, what they are detecting is a shortening night. And when night gets short enough, they're triggered to bloom. So here we have a fall blooming plant here. So late summer or fall blooming plants. When there is a short night, like in the spring, they do not bloom. In the fall, as we get a long period of darkness, long uninterrupted darkness, that triggers them to bloom. If you interrupt their darkness, like say you have a plant like this, like my African violet, that's living in your house, and you get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom and turn on a light, now it has interrupted darkness, and it doesn't take much, just seconds of interrupted darkness, and now it will be triggered not to bloom. For our spring or early summer blooming plants, they are detecting a short night. So if night is shorter than a certain amount of time, that triggers them to bloom. So in the summer, in the late summer and the fall, when we have a long night, they don't bloom. But if you have these plants, if you give them a flash of light during the night in the fall, you can trigger them to bloom. And in fact, this is used commercially. This property of these kind of plants is used commercially to force them to bloom for sale at the wrong time of the year, when they normally would not want to bloom in the spring. Plants also respond to gravity. You probably know that roots want to grow down and stems want to grow up. If you've ever had a plant that got knocked over in its pot in your house and nobody noticed, and you just left it on its side for a while, the stem starts to grow up. And if you could see the roots, you would see that they were starting to grow down. And this is called gravitropism. And we now know that they actually use gravity inside their cells, that there are special plastids that are very dense that will sink to the bottom of the cell, and that helps the cells detect gravity. So Statalis, this just, a lith is just means rock. So we now know that these are specialized plastids, but you can see them with the electron microscope images here. Statalis means they're detecting position. So they sink to the bottom of the cell, and that helps the cell know which way is down. So if it's a root, it's going to go down. If it's a shoot, that signal is going to be interpreted in the opposite way, and they're going to go up. Not all plants have statoliths that we can see, and it's thought that also the settling of just the ordinary organelles inside of the cells in response to gravity also triggers this same response. Let's do a little video here. Gravitropism. So here's a little mung bean. We're going to put it on its side. It's still got light. But now this little shoot is going to start to bend upwards. Plants also respond to mechanical stimuli, and this is sometimes a surprise that plants that are touched constantly, it can actually inhibit their growth and affect their growth and stunt them. So here's again our favorite experimental organism in the plant world, Arabidopsis, and the plants on the right were just touched a couple of times a day. They weren't abused, you know, somebody just came with their hand and touched them a couple of times a day. And just doing that triggers shorter growth. And you can imagine what would be the advantage of this? What would be the evolutionary advantage to this? Well, if the plants are in an environment where animals are constantly walking over them or touching them, staying short might help them to survive better in an environment like that. Thigmotropism is also what we call the way that specialized leaves in climbing plants move in response to touch. So these little pea tendrils here, they're specialized leaves. They stick out initially straight, and as the pea tries to find support, they slowly swing around in a circle. And then when it hits something, they coil around it. So that touch triggers the cells on the other side of the tendril to elongate again, and that causes bending. And that's how we get this coiling response, which allows them to climb on trellises. And we also and this can happen quite rapidly, and plants even have their own form of electrical impulses and action potentials, which we're going to hear a lot more about action potentials when we talk about animal nervous systems. If you've already studied the nervous system, action potential is going to sound like a familiar phrase to you. We don't have any mimosas in the lab right now, but mimosas are a plant that responds quite rapidly to touch. The leaves fold up within seconds of being touched, and that's a defense against predation from insects. So insects land on there and start biting the leaves, and the leaves all fold up, providing a much less hospitable surface for insects to sit there and munch on them. So here's a mimosa. And so you can do it by just touching it with your hand, or if you pinch one of the leaves or damage one of the leaves, it will fold up for quite a long time. Unfortunately, we don't have any in the lab right now because they're kind of fun to play with. So plants also have a number of defenses against herbivores other than, you know, that response that the mimosas have. So predation on plants is called herbivory, or if you don't pronounce the H, herbivory, like we tend to pronounce it in the US. And there are many ways to defend against herbivory. Like here we have, cactuses covered with spines. Those spines are a defense against animals that would want to bite the cactus and get the water that's in there. So there are many different levels of defense. Toxins and foul-tasting compounds are an excellent defense. We would call that a molecular defense. So turpentine is made from conifers that produce it as an inhibition to insects. Alkaloids of many types are toxic. Caffeine is produced by the coffee plant because it kills insects that bite the plant. Most of the kind of noxious compounds that are produced by plants, some of which are mildly toxic to us or extremely toxic to us, those are produced as a defense mechanism by the plant. Even our plants in the cabbage and the mustard family, that bitter taste that's in broccoli and all of the things in the cabbage family, that is produced because it's an excellent deterrent to insect predators. There's very few insects that will prey on cabbages or broccoli or anything in that family because of that. And in fact, the same thing is true of the opium poppy. It produces its toxic product, which we actually use as a painkiller. It produces that as a deterrent to those who would want to eat the seed pods. There are also mechanical defenses. There are many plants that have crystals inside the leaves or inside the fruits that would make it very unpleasant for an animal to eat them. And these are usually directed at large animal herbivores. Even bananas have these. So banana skins have these kind of crystals inside of the banana skin, and the banana fruit has hardly any of them. But some people are violently allergic to these crystals, and if you know somebody who's allergic to bananas, the skin would be a much more potent reaction for them because it contains many more of these hard crystals that are designed to prevent animals from wanting to eat that. Sometimes it's, they're calling this tissue level defenses. So sometimes the leaves and the fruits are just really hard and tough. The sclerenchyma tissue in a leaf or a stem makes it hard and rigid, which is good for helping the stem stay upright. But excessive amounts of this sclerenchyma can also make it unpleasant for herbivores to eat. So this is a cross-section of a leaf from an olive tree, and all of the stuff that's stained red here, that's the sclerenchyma. So olive leaves are really hard and rough and not very pleasant for an animal to eat. So that's another possible defense. Whole organs can be turned into defense mechanisms. So for example, the leaves on cactuses have been, through natural selection, they have become spines and bristles, and these are designed to be extremely unpleasant for herbivores to encounter. Sometimes just the stems have spines on them, and sometimes the entire plant is covered with spines and it has no leaves at all. And interestingly, sometimes as a defense mechanism, the leaves look like they've been eaten already, or they look like they already have insect eggs on them. There are a number of plants that excrete little structures on their leaves that look like insect eggs, because a moth or a butterfly will not lay their eggs on a leaf that already has eggs on it. This is a leaf from a plant called a snowflake plant because its leaves sort of look like snowflakes, and this is to deter herbivores because they look at this and they think it's already been eaten. It's designed not to look appetizing to them. And this is an example of, this is from a passion flower plant. It has these little nodules on it that look like moth eggs. to deter moths from laying more eggs on there. And I'm sorry if you keep hearing a bell ringing. That is my dog, who just was out minutes before I started the recording, is ringing the bell to go outside. Stop ringing that bell. Because that's how they ask to go out, because they don't have thumbs and they can't open the door. Some plants have very interesting responses to predators. There are certain plants in the Nicotiniana genus, which is tobacco, is Nicotiniana genus. There are some wild tobaccos that will change their flowering time to stop attracting moths. So this particular species of wild tobacco plant, normally it would bloom at night because its preferred pollinator is a moth. But if there's too many moth larvae chomping on the leaves, they switch to day blooming. And that way they stop attracting moths, and instead they start attracting hummingbirds to pollinate their flowers. There are some plants that time their flowering so that no predator could be completely dependent on them. They produce massive amounts of seeds from the entire population simultaneously, because no predator could survive if it only was dependent on that particular plant for its food. Sometimes they don't even produce seeds every year. For example, bamboo kind of takes this to the absolute extreme, and some kinds of bamboo only flower every 20 years, and all the plants in a particular area will all flower simultaneously in the same year. And it does cause a population explosion of herbivores like rats, like wild rats, but then they're going to die off the next year because the bamboo is not going to bloom again. There are plants that also communicate with each other, that if one plant is being attacked by insects, they will produce airborne pheromones to signal the other plants nearby of the same species to start producing toxic compounds so that they too will not be attacked by insects. So it's kind of they warn neighboring plants, the insects are here, you better start making your toxins. Interestingly, some plants also, if they're being attacked by larvae of moths, they will produce compounds, more pheromones, to attract predators of those moths. So many species of wasps are parasitic, and they lay their eggs on caterpillars or larvae of other species. And this is an example of that. This is a tomato hornworm caterpillar here. The kind of moth it grows into is a type of hawk moth. You can see it's called a hornworm because it has this little spine on the end. And it's absolutely covered with wasp cocoons. So the wasp comes and lays eggs on the caterpillar. The little larvae wasps crawl inside the caterpillar and slowly eat its insides. And then when they're ready to mature, they crawl to the outside and spin a little cocoon, because they have a larval stage and an adult stage too. And they are in there pupating, and the adult wasps are gonna hatch out of there. So the plant is able to signal to the wasps, hey, got some nice caterpillars over here, come and eat them. Which is actually really cool that something like that has evolved by natural selection. And these things are only in the last 20 or 30 years being understood, that plants are emitting these airborne pheromone signals to signal to insects, to signal to neighboring plants. This is all very new in botany and really interesting. Okay, so that's the end of plant responses. So we had our plant hormones, the 5 hormones that we looked at. We looked a little bit at plant responses to light, responses to gravity, and also responses to predators, things that want to eat the plants. And that's the end of our plant unit.